Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into our talk today, The Great Australian Dream, A Home of Our Own, part of the program for our new Making Modern Melbourne exhibition and presented as part of the Victorian Seniors Festival and History Month. My name is Katie and I'm Public Programs Coordinator here at the Old Treasury Building. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the Old Treasury Building is located on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Today, Margaret Anderson is going to reflect on the highs and lows of home building in Victoria and the ways the house has changed over the years. Margaret is a public historian with interest in women's history, the history and demography of the family, and the presentation of history in museums. And she's also director of the Old Treasury Building. Thanks, Margie.
Thanks, Katie, very much for that introduction, and thank you all of those who've joined us this morning. So today we're talking about the Great Australian Dream, a home of our own. All too often now we hear on the news that Australia is facing a housing crisis. When no less an analyst than Alan Kohler tells us this, I think we have to take it fairly seriously. In his quarterly essay entitled The Great Divide, Australia's Housing Mess and How to Fix It, published in 2023, Kohler said bluntly, the fact that one of the least populated countries on earth contains the world's second most expensive housing is a national calamity and a stunning failure of public policy. There are several components to the crisis, and political cartoonists have been quick to highlight them. At its heart are two fundamental issues. The first, that there simply are not enough affordable dwellings available for low-income households to rent, and the second, that house prices have risen to such an extent that many would-be first home buyers are now priced out of the market. Each of those might well constitute a crisis on its own, but it is often the plight of first home buyers that dominates discussion. And that is probably because for most of the 20th century and even before, owning a home of our own was such an important part of the Great Australian Dream, literally at the heart of what we've come to see as the Australian way of life. So let's unpick that a little over the next 45 minutes or so and look at what we know about the history of housing and home ownership in Victoria. We know that most of those who took the enormous gamble of emigration across the seas to Australia in the 19th century did so in the hope that they would improve their lot in life, that they would better themselves, to use the terminology of the 1850s. At the time of the gold rush, that often meant the dream for men that they can free themselves from a lifetime of the hard, unremitting manual labour that was the lot of most men. Even perhaps they might become a master of other men themselves. For women, it often meant to find themselves a comfortable home. And that sense developed early. From the middle decades of the 19th century, a separate dwelling with its own garden became a powerful ingredient in the way we imagined both family life and modest success. And over the decades, it shaped our lived experience of family to a significant extent. That sense was captured by the wonderful chronicler of Gold Rush Victoria, the artist S.T. Gill, in his well-known watercolour entitled The Lucky Digger That Returned, dated 1869, but actually first sketched in the 1850s. It shows a prosperous man in a comfortable living room with his wife, child, and the various possessions that indicated a comfortable life. Solid furniture, books, newspapers, pictures on the walls, and ornaments on the mantelpiece. But Gill was by no means alone in singling out homes and housing as markers of success. Indeed, Graham Davison argues that Australians consistently judge their standard of living by how well they were housed. The first houses were of necessity simple constructions, built of local timber, often wattle and daub so-called, with thatched roofs and the kitchens set at some distance from the house because of fire. We can see this from Samuel Jackson's remarkable panoramic drawing of Melbourne, sketched from the walls of Scott's Church in July 1841. He shows simple dwellings placed along the streets already marked out on Hoddle's famous grid pattern for Melbourne, and we can see that each of them is set in its own plot of land, much like a traditional English village. Within 20 years, almost all of those structures had been replaced with more substantial buildings of brick and stone. From the time of the gold rush onwards, many of those who came to Victoria as migrants hoped eventually to own a home of their own. Colonial architects modified British standard house designs for suburban cottages and villas to suit local tastes, adding the verandas popular in India for summer shade. And here is one example designed by local architect O.N. Nicholson for construction on Brunswick Street in Fitzroy in about 1882. It's a medium-sized, single-storey villa with a drawing room, a dining room, and 3 bedrooms, as well as a large kitchen, a scullery, and an internal bathroom. A small servant's room adjoins the kitchen, signalling that this was intended for a middle-class household, prosperous enough to keep a live-in servant. A wealthier household might well commission a 2-storey villa like this one, also designed by Nicholson for construction in Fitzroy. This design incorporates such obvious symbols of affluence as a large library, in addition to an impressive entrance hall, a parlour, and a dining room, and what are almost certainly 2 bedrooms for live-in servants near the kitchen. There are 3 family bedrooms, 1 downstairs and 2 on the first floor, along with a bathroom. Now, those who could afford it moved their families into the growing suburbs on the periphery of the city, travelling into town for work or to shop on horse-drawn omnibuses, and later by train. Soon, such cottages and Italianate villas dotted suburbs like Hawthorn to the east, Brighton to the southeast, and even Brunswick to the north. Would-be homeowners were assisted by Victoria's relatively high wages, the availability of affordable land, and credit from building societies ready to lend to those with steady incomes. The desire of Victorians to own a home of their own was sufficient to attract the interest of visitors, like the English writer Richard Tuppenny. In his book, Town Life in Australia, published in 1883, he had this to say about Australians and their houses. The colonist is very committed to living in his own house and on his own bit of ground, and building societies and the extensive mortgage system which prevails enable him easily to gratify that desire. Of course, those villas contrasted significantly with the much smaller cottages and row houses intended to house the families of working people. Most of those consisted of 3 or 4 rooms only, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, which often doubled as a living room, and later in the century, a small bathroom. These particular plans for what were probably intended as model homes for workers were drawn by architect William Pitt in about 1910 and have survived in the State Library's collection. They show a terrace of 4 single-fronted, single-storey row cottages, each with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen living room, and a bathroom. Each has a small yard behind, perhaps enough for a very small vegetable garden. But looking at these plans, you may well have noticed something else, and that is that each house also had an extension at the rear for a wash house and a WC, and I've highlighted 2 of those in the centre of the slide. Now let's look back to the plans for the villas from 2 decades earlier, and you will see no such inclusions. So this is probably a good opportunity to digress for a moment and to talk about household hygiene and toileting. You probably know something about Melbourne's unsavoury reputation for sanitation, or more accurately, the lack of it. It was not until 1898 that Melbourne was finally connected to a waterborne deep sewage system, and that was by no means all of the city. Significant areas of the central city, including major state government complexes like the Treasury Reserve, were not connected to the sewerage until 1905, and it was much later than that for many suburbs. Until that point, most households had a single backyard privy, usually positioned up against the back fence, abutting a laneway. The privy was emptied once a week by a night man who drove his horse and cart along the laneway at night, emptying what was euphemistically known as night soil into the cart and replacing the pan. The work was done at night because it was such a smelly business. Now, at first, these privies or pan toilets were simply buckets positioned under a wooden seat. But from the 1860s, they might have been earth closets. The earth closet was the invention of an English clergyman, the Reverend Henry Moole, in 1860, and it consisted of a wooden seat over a bucket with a box alongside containing earth or ashes, and you can see one in the top illustration here. Users sprinkled a scoop of earth into the pan after use. A later improved version featured a hopper above filled with earth or ash. When the handle was pulled, a layer of earth was released into the bucket, which was emptied periodically by the nightman. Now, the earth or ash was intended to help to minimise odours, which in the 1860s was still thought to cause disease. And large numbers of earth closets were installed in Melbourne from the mid-1860s, including several installed in a row behind the Old Treasury Building in 1868. And until that point, incidentally, there was no provision made for the ordinary workers in the building at all. By the late 1850s, some households in Melbourne were also able to install water closets using piped water from the Yan Yean Reservoir. And we saw this illustration of a water closet alongside the earth closet earlier. Here is a later, much improved version from the 1890s. Water closets had been around for a while by the 1850s, but they were not very efficient. They worked by releasing a volume of water, and 3 gallons was standard in Melbourne, from a raised cistern which was supposed to cleanse the bowl, flushing the contents away into a drain. There were 2 main problems. The first was that the flush was not very effective at first. It was released too slowly, and the water often failed to clear the bowl. The second was more serious, and that was the problem of disposing of all of this additional contaminated water. Until Melbourne was deep sewered, such waste emptied from household drains into cesspits. These were literally holes dug into the ground. They were supposed to be lined with bricks, and from the 1860s were also supposed to be watertight, but they often weren't. And once healthy households began sending vastly greater quantities of water and sewage into the cesspits, many of them simply couldn't cope with the load and overflowed into nearby laneways and backyards. It was a serious health hazard. And this, incidentally, might explain why the villas designed to be built in the older suburb of Fitzroy in the 1880s didn't include internal WCs. Throughout these decades, there was a running dispute between the 2 suburbs of Fitzroy and the adjacent Collingwood. Collingwood was built on lower ground on the natural slope towards the river. In the 1880s and 90s, Collingwood streets were regularly flooded with waste from the cesspits of Fitzroy, especially when winter rains left the soil sodden. Nevertheless, internal water closets were the latest fashion for wealthy households, and increasing numbers were being installed in Melbourne's villas. Young architect of the Old Treasury Building, John James Clark, designed such closets for 2 Carlton semi-detached residences he created on contract to a private architect in 1857. You can see the plans here. These residences may well have been intended to be so-called gentlemen's residences, since they include both a study and an office downstairs, and only 1 bedroom, although interestingly enough 2 drawing rooms, upstairs. There is no kitchen shown either, although there is a dining room, so perhaps the assumption was that all of the meals will be brought in ready-made. And there is no bathroom. We don't know, incidentally, whether these residences were ever built. Now, it was the founder of Methodism, Charles Wesley, who famously declared, "Cleanliness is next to godliness," in the late 18th century. But what he meant by that is not quite what we might mean now. In the mid-19th century, the most usual equipment for a daily ablution was a jug and basin in the bedroom. That served to wash face, neck, and hands, almost certainly in cold water. Then once a week, a tin bath was probably laboriously filled with hot water from a laundry copper for the weekly bath, often taken on a Saturday night and probably performed in the kitchen in front of the range. This was a pattern that continued for decades in many ordinary households, certainly well into the 1920s. The alternative was to visit a communal bath and wash house, first established as private ventures in Melbourne in the 1850s. The fine city baths opened in 1860, although the current building of that name that you can see in the slide here was built on the same site in 1904. It was designed by, you guessed it, John James and Edward James Clark. As Melbourne prospered in the late 19th century, more households could aspire to home ownership, and the city expanded outwards to incorporate new subdivisions. One such subdivision was the Murrabinda estate in Brunswick, one of many designed to appeal to working people. This poster promised liberal terms and, quote, villa sites on what it described as a perfect estate. Most of the allotments were actually very small, just 11 metres wide by 35 metres deep, or 385 square metres overall. But they did offer space for both a modest house and a small garden plot. The seller also offered a 12-month payment plan with a minimum deposit of £5 and other payments at intervals of 3 months at 6% interest. Ventures like this one allowed working people to enter the housing market, and Graham Davison reports that by 1891, about 42% of occupiers in Melbourne either owned or were buying their own homes. The proportion was actually higher in rural areas and in mining towns where land was more abundant and cheaper. A few places in the world exhibited similar rates at that time. And yet it was very far from a majority of households, and it could prove to be a fragile dream. When a deep recession struck the colony in the 1890s, working people who were buying their own homes suffered immediately. The housing industry was the first to collapse, along with associated industries like brickworks and roofing factories. As industry closed and wages dried up, so the banks and building societies foreclosed on desperate owners. It was said that as the local brickworks, the major employer in Brunswick, closed its doors during the 1890s depression, whole streets were empty with houses boarded up against squatters. Many people were effectively homeless, and their situation was dire. Now, for all of the 19th and most of the 20th century, the family was seen as the desired basis for a virtuous society. And home ownership was also thought to contribute to social stability by giving households a solid stake in the community. That encouraged governments at both state and federal level to support schemes to assist home buyers. One important initiative in Victoria was the State Savings Bank of Victoria's Home Building Scheme. This program was created to assist first home buyers who earned less than £400 per year to build on their own land or on blocks of land purchased from the bank. Purchasers required a 10% deposit and had to maintain a savings account at the bank for some years before they could qualify for a loan. This was intended to demonstrate their capacity to save and presumably their capacity to repay any loan. Long-term loans were then made available at low interest rates to build homes, with the bank holding title to the land as collateral. The scheme began in 1910 and was soon a great success, both socially and financially for the bank. At first, the value of the loan was capped at £800, and this was all-inclusive, meaning land, construction, sewerage, outbuildings, fencing, lighting, water supply, and drainage. Buyers also had to pay for the house plans and for supervision of construction. However, it was soon evident that this was not sufficient to cover the cost of building brick homes, and in 1922 the cap was increased to £850 for timber homes and £950 for brick. The loan was repayable monthly at 8.5% per annum, including interest at 6.5%. In the 1920s, the bank established its own building department, which provided architect-designed house plans with detailed specifications for both brick and timber-framed dwellings. Now, I don't know whether you'll be able to see them very clearly here, but this shows you some of the list of specifications for timber-framed houses in 1936. Regular tenders were called from prospective builders, and the bank supervised the subsequent build. Not surprisingly, such so-called bank houses acquired an enviable reputation for quality. Here is an example of one architectural design submitted in response to a call for tenders. It was prepared by William Pitt and Walkley architects in about 1920, just before the bank established its own building department. As you can see, it depicts a modest 5-roomed house with 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. No WC is shown, so we can assume that this was intended to be located on the back fence line, and nor is there a laundry or wash house shown in the plans. By the mid to late 1920s, the homes built by the State Savings Bank of Victoria seem to have included both laundries and WCs in their house plans, although they were commonly placed at the rear of the house. And while the laundry in these designs was entered through a porch area, the WC was generally accessed from outside the house, meaning that the family still had to chance the weather to enter the toilet. The bathroom is fitted with a bath, but there is no toilet in the bathroom. The differences between the two designs shown here, and here's the next one, are minor, but no doubt significant to the homeowner. Plan T34 is slightly larger. It has a pantry cupboard attached to the kitchen instead of a smaller larder, and it has a slightly larger linen press. Both laundries show a copper for heating the water and 2 laundry troughs, although some houses preferred 3 troughs at this time. Each features 6 main rooms. There are open fireplaces in the living and breakfast rooms, but probably by then a gas stove in the kitchen. Some local councils were also very active in promoting home ownership. The Port Melbourne Council lobbied strenuously in the 1920s for affordable housing to be built on reclaimed land in the area. And eventually the State Savings Bank stepped in and offered house plans to build new homes for sale on 18 hectares of land they purchased in 1926. The subdivision was designed on popular garden city principles and ultimately included 322 semi-detached dwellings built to 6 designs. The bank also made loans available at affordable interest rates, with the property held as collateral, so-called credit foncier system. Now, at this stage, of course, there were none of the display villages that would come later, and no 3-dimensional imaging either. So the bank produced cardboard cutout models to scale. These could be assembled to show buyers what their homes would look like once built. Now, one of those assembled models has been preserved in the collection of Public Record Office, Victoria, along with the cardboard poster with the cutout. Here is the model house. As you can see, the home is named the Home of Achievement, the House of Achievement. And what the bank meant by that rather cheesy name is spelled out in the cutout poster prospective buyers purchased. it's a bit hard to read, so I've actually printed out, reproduced the text there for you. Now, we would see this as outrageously paternalistic now, but it probably fitted the context of the times. The silent guardians of the House of Achievement are the three pillars: purpose, industry, and thrift. Purpose. Without purpose, nothing worthwhile is possible. Every house has a plan. Every life should have a plan. The foundation of every plan is purpose. Make up your mind as to what you want your life to be. Determine now that someday you will have a house of your own, and begin to work and save for it. Industry. Without industry, the wheels of purpose cannot be kept moving. Industry is the art of finding something worth doing and doing it well, of keeping everlastingly at it. Thrift. Without thrift, the fruits of purpose in industry will be lost. Thrift is the storehouse that garners the fruits of industry and makes them available when needed. And then there's our little ditty about only a penny, concluding if we fail to pay attention to the pennies, it is not likely we will ever have many pounds. Now, the Great Depression of 1929 saw a temporary pause in the bank's home lending scheme, although it did carry out repairs. The bank was also more understanding of financial distress than many other lenders, reducing interest rates on loans to a maximum of 6% in 1931 and then 4.5% in 1934. Some loans were reduced to interest only for a number of years. But by the mid-1930s, as conditions improved, the bank resumed the scheme. At that point, prospective owners could choose from some 50 house plans, and these varied from single-fronted, one-bedroom homes to more substantial houses built in timber or brick. All now contained a bathroom with a bath under the main roof and a laundry and WC, generally at the back of the house. There are still no WCs in bathrooms. Access to the WC varied, with some now entered from a back porch alongside the laundry, but other designs still showed external access, and that doesn't seem to reflect the size of the house, interestingly enough. While some house plans included either dining or breakfast rooms as well as a kitchen, there was one innovation in the 1930s that would continue into the 1940s and 50s. That was the breakfast nook or alcove. You can see one shown in Plan T8 here. It was probably a space-saving device to provide an eating area adjacent to, but not actually within, the kitchen. Almost all of the plans available in timber-framed houses showed 2 bedrooms, though there were 2 plans offering an additional sleep-out, probably with the familiar louvered windows often used with enclosed verandas, and you can see those indicated here. There was also one plan that offered 3 bedrooms but no separate breakfast dining room, but there was only one plan that offered 3 bedrooms plus a breakfast room. Family size had fallen by the 1930s to an average of between 2 and 3 children, but even so, these plans seem to have assumed that children would share a single bedroom, at least while they were small. There was an established assumption by then that boys and girls should be separated by the time they reached puberty, and that may be reflected in the house plans showing either a 3rd bedroom or a sleep-out. It was customary for any boys to be relegated to the sleep-out, sometimes, as Marilyn Lake has argued, along with the father as a birth control measure. There was not yet an assumption that children were entitled to a bedroom of their own. That would come much later. Meanwhile, the main determinant of how well a family was housed was income. For a long time, it was simply accepted that society was divided along class lines and that a proportion of any population would be poor. Those who attended church regularly were probably told that this reflected divine will. While there were obvious philosophical challenges to such views by the later 19th century, notably from adherents of socialism, vestiges of these attitudes remained. Generations of Sunday school children sang the hymn, all things bright and beautiful, perhaps without thinking too deeply about what the words meant. It was first written as one of a collection of hymns for little children in 1848. By the time I was singing it, there was a verse missing, but that verse was sung routinely at least until the Second World War. You may know it. Now, I'm not going to sing it, but it went like this. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high or lowly and ordered their estate. All things bright and beautiful, etc. Now, Melbourne was no more immune to the problems of poor housing than any other city of the time, although perhaps its slums were less dire than those of much older cities like London, but they were bad enough. Those on very low or precarious incomes struggled to rent in crowded, low-cost accommodation in the inner city and surrounding inner suburbs. Here, poorly built houses often fell into disrepair, as landlords balked at even routine maintenance. Low-lying suburbs near the river were subject to flooding. Before the city was deep sewered in the early 20th century, cesspits overflowed regularly and outbreaks of typhoid and other enteric disease were common. From the end of the 19th century, groups of concerned citizens called for what they called slum clearance, but their efforts met with little success. Government was reluctant to demolish substandard housing when poor tenants had no alternative accommodation, and there was little appetite in government to construct what we now call social housing. But in the wake of the Great Depression, there was something of a change of heart. Social advocates like Frederick Oswald Barnett and the Housing Reform Council, later known as the Slum Abolition and Better Housing League, documented conditions in Melbourne slums. I'm using the word slum in inverted commas because it is a debated term for Melbourne. Many of their photographs showed women and children in filthy, impoverished conditions. None of these houses had anything approaching the pristine bathrooms shown in the State Bank plans. Their photographs of living conditions in the inner suburbs, published in newspapers like the Herald, shocked complacent Melburnians. But worse was to come. A report commissioned by Victoria's Housing Investigation and Slum Abolition Board, created in response to this campaign, documented housing in inner Melbourne and its near suburbs. It found people crammed into areas with as many as 49 dwellings per acre, many in very poor repair. An internal survey of over 6,000 of these substandard residences within an 8-kilometre radius of the city found that most had no proper kitchens, a third had no bathroom, and a quarter had neither gas nor electricity. Half of those houses were found to be unfit for habitation without substantial repair. The other half could not even be repaired. It was a grim report and prompted government to create the Housing Commission of Victoria in 1937. The Housing Commission had a brief to improve housing conditions for low-income families and to develop low-cost accommodation, both rental and for sale. One such development was located in Port Melbourne, on 22 hectares of land adjacent to the State Bank's Garden City development. Here, the Housing Commission built accommodation to rehouse large, so-called deprived families in the late 1930s. Unfortunately, this didn't go quite to plan. In what would become a familiar story, there was conflict over the development, with opposition from some of the homeowners of the established Garden City development. And tensions simmered on and off between the homeowners on what was known as Nob Hill and the tenants of what was rudely called Little Baghdad. But in fact, the Housing Commission had barely begun its task when the Second World War intervened. All home building ceased immediately as resources were reallocated to the war effort. But even during wartime, plans were being made for the peace. principally by a remarkable initiative of the Commonwealth Government through its Department of Post-War Reconstruction. This was headed by a visionary public servant, Herbert Cole, known as Nugget Coombs, who argued from the beginning, it is in the home that our reconstruction must begin. The Commonwealth Government's Housing Commission was created in 1943 and immediately instituted an inquiry, visiting 53 urban centres in its first year of operation. Their interests showed a remarkable similarity to those of Barnett and the other slum clearance campaigners, with photographs like these designed to shock. In an interim report published in October 1943, they set out as their first guiding principle that a, quote, dwelling of good standard and equipment is not only the need, but the right of every citizen. They added that private enterprise couldn't possibly provide sufficient dwellings at a price those on low incomes could afford, but also argued that it was not capable of building enough houses to clear the backlog of housing needed, which they estimated then at 300,000 in 1945. Only government, they said, could provide affordable housing for those on low incomes, the cost of which should be capped at no more than 1/6 of the family income. Their third principle was very revealing. Housing, they argued, meant more than shelter. It was an expression of the way of life of the people. In its final report, the Federal Housing Commission also set out what it saw as minimum public housing standards, and they included the following. The bathroom should be at least 30 square feet with a bath, a shower, a wash basin, and that the WC should be indoors. The kitchen should have a refrigerator, a stove, a sink, and running water, all amenities found so conspicuously absent in many of the surveys of some housing. In publicity messages addressed to Mrs. Australia, the government assured her that you and I and our 300,000 neighbours will get our dream houses. But while Mrs. Australia was the intended audience for this propaganda, there was no assumption that she would necessarily be consulted on the homes themselves. In vain, organisations like the National Council of Women, the Housewives Associations, and other women's groups lobbied for their representatives to be appointed to these bodies. But in the end, one sole woman, Mary Ryan, was appointed to the Federal Housing Commission. She was, as she described herself, an ordinary housewife from Prime Minister Chifley's electorate. Nevertheless, the Federal Housing Commission's report represented a visionary proposal for a post-war world. But in the end, the Commonwealth balked at embarking on such an ambitious program alone, preferring to work in a partnership with the states. In a familiar story, it also encountered opposition from those state governments with existing housing programs. Meanwhile, after 6 long years of war, Victorians celebrated the peace in 1945 with unrestrained joy. But it was soon very evident that there was a peacetime housing crisis. The combined effects of the Great Depression and then the Second World War had left Victoria with an estimated shortfall of 350,000 homes in that state alone. It didn't help that the end of the war saw both a marriage boom, shortly thereafter, a baby boom, followed by a vigorous immigration program. With such a shortage of houses, these new families were living in all sorts of ramshackle structures, from garden sheds to converted garages, while many newlyweds were forced to move in with in-laws. Former army camps like the notorious Camp Pell in Royal Park were pressed into service. Even those who could afford to build houses couldn't necessarily get permission to do so, and my parents were amongst them. For many years after the war, building restrictions still prevailed to conserve scant building resources, and those lucky enough to be given building permits were forced to build according to strict guidelines, to plans now designed along new, modernist lines. These favoured open planning with less wasted space in corridors, porches and verandas. Kitchens were compact, often with adjacent dining alcoves. On the plus side were built-in cupboards and provision for the new white goods, like refrigerators. Many of these principles were already incorporated in designs offered by the State Savings Bank in their 1940 catalogue, which was printed despite the fact that all building was paused for the war. Not everyone was pleased with these new modernist designs. A public opinion poll conducted in 1945 found that most consumers still wanted a veranda, and nearly half preferred what they called a traditional kitchen. Some, like my aunt, managed to squeeze in what she considered a proper dining room by making economies elsewhere. But even with these reservations, there was still a very clear preference for new, modern housing in suburbs far removed from the dingy row cottages of the inner city. But there was still a long waiting list for homes, and those with the requisite skills sometimes built their own. The 1950s was a boom time for DIY home builders. To meet this need and provide a service for those on limited budgets, the Royal Institute of Architects created the Small Homes Service. The service offered prospective homeowners advice and access to cheap, architecturally designed house plans. For just £5, Melburnians could buy a house plan, find a builder to build it, or build it themselves. Here is one brochure showing plans from the Small Homes Service in 1959. It shows a one-bedroom home with future options for 2 additional bedrooms. The brochure emphasises that the plans conform to the 14-square limit set by the State Building Directorate, still in place in 1959. Now, it's estimated that about 25% of all homes built in the 1950s were DIY. Museums Victoria has preserved the story of one group of Ukrainian immigrants who are a great example of this. They arrived in Victoria as displaced persons after the Second World War, and after initial periods on required government work assignment, Ivan Kukan and 5 friends came to Melbourne, looking for land to settle. They all bought land in the same street in Newport and helped each other to build their homes. And here they are at work on one of those homes. And here is Ivan's family some years later, standing proudly in the backyard of their home on Ukrainian Christmas Day, which is usually sometime in early January 1957. And Christmas was a popular time to take photographs such as these, perhaps to indicate the difference in the seasons, but also possibly to show the achievement of home ownership. With all this building taking place in such a short space of time, other facilities didn't always keep up, and Mrs. Australia must sometimes have wondered about the reality of her dream home. Government and local councils struggled to provide even basic facilities to some new subdivisions, and householders had to put up with unmade streets, open drains, and even an absence of such basic amenities as a proper water supply in some areas. This slide shows flooding in Cuthbert Street Reservoir in 1953, while this shows women collecting water in buckets to take home in the same year. By the late 1960s, new estates were obliged to provide all such amenities before occupation, but it took time to put those regulations in place. Nothing seems to have dampened the enthusiasm for home ownership, though, which had already risen to 53% by 1947 and was climbing rapidly. In the post-war period, both state and federal governments focused their attention and assistance on encouraging home ownership. The election of Robert Menzies' Liberal government in 1949 saw a swift end to the more ambitious social housing aims of post-war reconstruction. And the long tenure of Henry Bolte in Victoria from 1955 to 72 saw a similar focus on assisting home buyers instead. home ownership reached a peak of 71% of all occupiers in 1966, while public housing accounted for only 5% of all housing stock. Nevertheless, the Housing Commission soldiered on, building a mix of houses and flats, some for purchase, some for rent. Victorians continued to prefer to live in houses rather than apartments, but tastes were beginning to change. At the time of the 1954 census, there were less than 26,000 flats in Melbourne as a whole. By the 1970s, more than 13,000 new flats were being built annually, partly in response to shrinking land availability, but also reflecting changing urban preferences. However, the Commission also built many single dwellings, and from 1943 could offer lease and rental options to occupiers who wished either to rent or to buy a home. Many were delighted to be allocated a home, especially those who were new migrants, like the Duncans and the Beadles shown here on Christmas Day, again, in West Heidelberg, 1953. Anne Beadles and Frances Duncan were sisters. The two families lived together for a year, while the Duncans, who were recent migrants, waited for a house to become available. They were thrilled to find one just up the street. The Housing Commission was very active in these years. In 1945, it acquired the former Holmesglen munitions factory to mass-produce precast concrete components for public housing. By 1956, the Commission had built 32,000 homes, mostly single-family homes and low-rise apartments. But other building projects of the Housing Commission were not so popular. In the 1960s, the Commission adapted its precast concrete method to build high-rise apartment blocks in Melbourne's inner suburbs, seen here in some of these images. This was despite the fact that the high-rise model was already being questioned in Britain. This new housing was controversial. Stark concrete towers began to circle the city, punctuating the skyline, while families in existing houses resented the compulsory acquisition of their homes. The Atherstone estate in Fitzroy, for example, required the demolition of 184 dwellings and displaced 561 people. It also demolished many heritage structures, like the bluestone warehouse shown here on the left. Determined resident groups formed in opposition. While people queued to inspect this new tower in South Melbourne, for example, a lone protester, shown here on the right, held up a sign reading, "A farmer's dream of town planning, 500 sheep to the acre." Between 1962 and 1974, the Housing Commission built 47 high-rise towers at 21 locations across Melbourne. A rising tide of dissent halted further developments in the 1970s. Of course, those high-rise developments would be involved in controversy all over again during the COVID lockdowns in 2020, when the lack of access to fresh air was a particular issue. The Housing Commission was eventually abolished in 1984, but the acute shortage of affordable housing has led to suggestions that some similar body might be reconstituted now. The State Savings Bank also continued to offer housing loans in the 1960s, with plans provided, as seen from this brochure of house plans from about 1960, held in Museums Victoria's collection. Although clearly designed on modernist lines, other features in these plans suggest a transitional phase in building design. The home shown has only 2 bedrooms, although space is allocated for a future 3rd bedroom, while the laundry still suggests the use of a copper and troughs rather than an automatic washing machine. On the other hand, provision is made to house a hot water heater internally. This was a very welcome addition, providing abundant hot water in kitchens and bathrooms without the use of the very tricky and sometimes dangerous chip bath heater. Looking at this brochure now might also suggest a certain nostalgia for the bank's slogan. It's your bank, guaranteed by your government. Alas, all that would unravel in the greedy decade of the 1980s. For other prospective home buyers, there was a veritable feast of options. Building companies like A.V. Jennings offered package deals of design and construction, with buyers choosing from varied design options. Most of those were designed on new modernist lines, with fewer hallways and more open-plan layouts. While these didn't necessarily reflect buyer preference even then, what began as a post-war austerity measure continued into the 1960s and 70s house design. Companies also began to construct display homes, sometimes clustered in villages to demonstrate design options. And visiting display homes became a weekend pastime for young couples hoping to buy. And incidentally, you might be interested by the prices that are shown on the placard there. As these Jennings plans indicate, houses in the 1960s began to be larger, with 3 bedrooms increasingly common. The house plans shown here all have bathrooms as a matter of course, generally now with both a bath and a small shower recess, a separate WC and a laundry all under the main roof. Some of the WCs are still accessed internally, others from a porch or laundry. The laundries all seem to assume the use of a washing machine, but it is harder to see whether the kitchen assumed a refrigerator. Almost certainly it did, since over 90% of households owned one by then. Towards the end of the last century, houses began to grow larger again. It was increasingly assumed that children should have their own bedrooms, at least in their teens. Although as family size fell yet again, this was usually achievable with 3 bedrooms. Nevertheless, 4-bedroom houses were increasingly common, while family and entertainment rooms are often added to the existing lounge, along with a second bathroom, sometimes ensuite to the main bedroom. Dining rooms, on the other hand, became less common. Houses also began to occupy far more of the available block size, with less interest in large yards. The vegetable garden, once ubiquitous in the backyard, was less common, although the tradition of growing food continued in some households. Others paved over most of the lot space, with only a small front garden and perhaps a small section of lawn. Of course, in this century, apartment building has also escalated in the city and inner suburbs. Melbourne's first modernist high-rise apartment building, Edgewater Towers, was designed by Jewish immigrant architect Mordecai Benchmish and constructed in St Kilda in 1959. Hundreds of such buildings now dot the skyline in the CBD and in increasing numbers in inner suburbs like Brunswick. Some of these developments, like this one, have met with strenuous resident opposition, but the desperate need for dwellings often overrides such concerns. Whether they will ultimately fulfill the dreams of occupants to live in a home of their own remains to be seen. Research suggests that the Australian dream has been remarkably consistent through the generations and has stubbornly resisted attempts to reframe it. Like their parents and grandparents, contemporary Australians continue to dream of owning a detached house with its own bit of land around it. But rising property prices and steady population increases may mean that an increasing proportion will find that dream an elusive one. Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. That was just wonderful. There's something really special about housing plans, I find. I just love them. So, Margie, if you've caught your breath, we seem to have a question in the Q&A. This person thanks you for a very informative session. They immigrated to Australia 11 years ago and had no idea about housing in Australia, and they're very interested in the topic. They studied cultural heritage and museum studies, and the lecture helps to understand how housing's developed over the years and why they look so different to houses back in Europe. Thank you for your comment. Um,
Thank you, Lena. And I mean, it is a very interesting question, isn't it? Because as Australians move increasingly towards what they might see or we might see as an English or a European model in cities, there is a very different attitude, as you've pointed out there, and that's very interesting. We're certainly in transition. Whether we're there yet, I'm not so sure. Thanks for
mhm.
your comment.
The sleep outs of the 1930s, would they have been used for isolating family members with infectious disease?
Oh, that's an interesting comment, isn't
It
it? Thanks,
is.
Christine. I've got absolutely no idea.
Mm,
I suppose they could have been. You'd then have to have relocated those who normally slept there, I suppose. But yes, I mean, there were also people. I had a great aunt whom I never met, but who famously slept on the veranda in all seasons because she thought it was more healthy, because of the fresh air. So,
mm,
I mean, that does suggest that there was a notion that sleeping like that could be more healthy, but also it would be a way of isolation. I wonder if there's any evidence of that having been used in the influenza epidemic in
mm.
1919. It's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to it.
Definitely is. I was at Ripponlea a few weeks ago. Very different to a family home, but they told us that the outdoor veranda, the children used to sleep there during the 1919 pandemic because of
Really?
exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah, because they
Mm.
had influenza or to stop them getting
To
it.
stop them getting it.
Oh,
And
right.
Ambleside
Okay.
Park apparently has it as well.
Right. Okay.
Mm,
So there we are. Wasn't
fascinating.
only my rather odd great aunt then.
We were talking before we started. What do you think the homes of the future are going to look like? We've had a lot of change with bathrooms and the laundry coming inside. It strikes me that with work from home, the study is becoming more and more, and I certainly, when I move, I will be demanding a study.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? The
Mhm.
post-COVID house that's both house and workplace. Now, I didn't try and go there at all. One of the difficulties, which people might realize in trying to look at housing, and particularly if you want house plans and things, any time after the 1970s, that it's almost impossible to use them because of copyright restrictions and things. But yes, that's a really interesting question. Will homes in the future be built more with home offices and home studies? They're already beginning to be, I think. The four-bedroom home, generally, the assumption was that one of those rooms would either be a guest room or an office, or a study, so called. But I do think that we might start to see that. I'd be fascinated if any architects actually listen to this talk and have a view on that. I'd be very interested to hear whether architects are now receiving requests to try and build in the home office either as a sort of a nook somewhere, or as separate offices, as part of the house. And I know that, I mean, things like granny flats and things. There's also so-called granny flats or teenage retreats or whatever they're called, is also a feature of home renovation, probably more than building, but certainly home renovation in the last few decades.
We've got one more question, and we might leave it after this one. What has been the social history behind the situation we have now? They read recently that Australians build on average the largest private houses in the world. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yes, indeed. Well, some of that I hope I answered in saying that there is this attachment to the notion of a discrete house in its own yard. But as to building the largest houses, I agree with you, that notion that the footprint of the house has grown and grown, and that is very much a feature of the time from about the 1980s onwards, apart from the very wealthy, of course, who could always afford to do that, and who did so. but that was a tiny proportion of the population. Now, it was interesting, the A.V. Jennings home in the display home, you might have noticed that it showed on the sign that home was 14 squares,
Mm.
which was still a small home. We might now regard as a small home. That would have still qualified during the post-war period as conforming to those regulations. So that is very interesting. What's behind it, I can't say. Seeing family sizes consistently reduced as well. So there is absolutely no need in most households to accommodate children in all that extra space. But they're larger areas and they're different spaces. So family rooms in addition to a lounge room, for example, entertainment rooms. If
Mm.
I'm not sure how common they are, but they certainly exist. Um, and yes, there's a comment there, living inside so much on devices. That may well be the case.
Thank you, Margie, and thanks everyone for watching. A reminder that the Victorian Seniors Festival and History Month are both on for the rest of the month, and there's some wonderful events to see and visit. Our Making Modern Melbourne exhibition is available for free at the Old Treasury Building. We're open every day except Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Thank you everyone for listening, and we hope to see you in the museum soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Katie, and thanks, everyone.